raging wildfire now moves in, devastating the heart of Canada's oil-producing region. Terrified families rushing away on the one road out of town.
Firefighters call it the Beast, a 240,000-acre inferno shifting with the wind. Flames moving so quickly, homes are devoured in minutes.
Climate change has changed the nature of fire to the point that I coined a term, which is 21st century fire, because it really does burn in qualitatively different ways now. And one example is Fort McMurray, where we're in the subarctic, in the boreal forest, 600 miles north of the U.S. border. It's a cool, damp place historically. On May 3rd, the temperature was in the low 90s. It was like California, and the relative humidity was around 11 or 12%. And you have to go to Death Valley in July to find a comparable humidity.
That's author John Vaillant, author of Fire Weather. He's from Vancouver, and he did a 7-year stint writing a book about fire based on the Fort McMurray, Alberta fire. Many of you may have heard of it when it happened. You might have forgotten about it. It is a city that has emerged where the oil sands are in Canada. It's 100 kilometers away from Edmonton. It's a long way from anywhere. It's in the middle of the boreal forest. It's about 70,000 people, but there are at times 30,000 temporary workers there. So some of them are in camps. My brother-in-law was a person who went into a camp up until about a year ago when I think he retired. It's in the middle of basically nowhere, and it's the Athabasca oil sands. It is a very ritzy place, lots of money being made from oil. They mine millions of barrels a day, 4 million barrels a day of bitumen, which is basically tar. Because it exists to serve the oil industry, the median income in Fort McMurray is $200,000 per person, which is very high for anywhere.
Yeah, you could make a lot of money there. We talked about the graphic novel Ducks, which is about...
Yes, and the author referenced that book in a speech that I watched too, so...
Yeah, Kate Beaton worked there for 2 years to pay off her student loans from going to university, and managed to do it and get a great graphic novel out of it, although the rest of the experience was not great for her.
Most of the homes there cost between $300,000 to $500,000. This is basically a big suburb that was just built overnight, very quickly. And none of the homes are, terribly modest. On May 1st, 2016, a fire broke out in unusually dry forests with unusually hot weather with unusually low humidity. Winds brought the fire raging towards the city. People fled with the clothes on their backs out of the one highway that led out of the city. That's another problem with these areas that infringe on, wild areas, is that there's often one road going to it. Deer on fire ran into a car fleeing the fires. Paint melted on cars as they tried to leave. Of course, there was congestion in the roads, heavy smoke and heat. The fire was so relentless in the city that firefighters, and I didn't know this, demolished about 50 $500,000 homes to create a fire break in the city. It was incredible. Prior to that, some of these people worked on the Slave Lake fire. These are fires that are changing that firefighters hadn't seen before, and they didn't think they could save the city. They took extreme measures to try and save other homes by tearing down 50 $500,000 homes. It's a miracle everyone actually got out unscathed. They did. There's some related deaths afterwards, but the lingering effects of lung issues and PTSD remain for some residents, says the author of this book. And by the way, it's on audiobook. I know you don't read anymore, so I've got a hold on the audiobook. It's like a 10-week wait. But yeah, I've watched hours and hours of this guy giving lectures and interviews with him to get information because I couldn't get the book. The book is available on Amazon. You can get it there. But because of my vision, I decided I would wait for the audiobook because I have vision issues right now. So author John Vaillant spent 7 years following the fire, writing a book trying to understand what happened and what lessons can be learned.
Yeah, so I do love audiobooks, and Yes, I guess you're waiting for it from the public library, which is a great place to get audiobooks, and highly recommended that everybody sign up to their local library. So yeah, the award-winning book, it's called Fire Weather. Firefighters the world over told the author that the wildfires are not what they used to be. He sees fire now as the biggest threat from climate change, and they will impact cities more and more, like they did in Los Angeles, Fort McMurray, Lahaina, Hawaii, where 102 people lost their lives in 2023, which we would have talked about here. And we have a clip of the author here reading a passage from this book, Fire Weather.
When those houses are clad in vinyl siding, it literally adds fuel to the fire. Firefighters refer to this cheap, weatherproof material as solidified gasoline. When a boreal fire is projecting 1,000-degree heat and blizzards of burning embers into a recently built neighborhood, the houses stop being houses. They become, instead, petroleum vapor chambers.
He says that heat radiating from a fire like that, and by the way, when heat radiates from a fire, it travels at the speed of light. So it can be 200 feet away, it could be 500 to 1,000 degrees Celsius, and that heat will radiate ahead of where the fire is. So it preheats the places where it's going to burn. This is not the case in LA. In LA, there was not tall forests. There was just brush, and that brush burned homes. The embers burned homes. The embers, homes created more embers, and it was a repeat effect there. So fire superheats building materials in advance. And he says, ironically, most of the homes in Fort McMurray, which is there because of the fossil fuel industry, were made from fossil fuels. The glues in the wood, the particle board, the plywood, of course, the vinyl siding, plastic vinyl windows, all that stuff gets hot. And the tires on cars will get hot and it'll off gas. And this gas builds up ahead of the fire and just becomes a ball of fire itself because it is flammable. So yeah, and it dries out vegetation and all the off gases come, and it just everything just bursts into a fiery cloud that the firefighters call dragons. Now here's John Vaillant talking to the Carnegie Institute about the commonalities of fire denial and climate change denial.
By now, the fire was in his neighborhood, coming down his street. His wife and daughter had already left in their vehicles on the one road out, which was extraordinarily dangerous, but there was no other choice. Meanwhile, he's there. I worked my whole life to pay for this house, to buy these things. I'm way up in Fort McMurray, 600 miles north of the U.S. border, in the middle of the forest. Not just because I love it here, but because this is where the money is, and this is where I was able to make a beautiful life for my family. And I'm not ready to give it up. And so there's a police officer dragging this guy away from his door. He fights the police officer off. He runs back to police officers. What the hell do you think you're doing? He said, I'm locking my door. And then this fellow, Paul, looks at me as he's recounting the story, and he said, I didn't think my house would burn down. And again, 100-foot flames moving through the neighborhood in this like an inexorable wave. There was no other possibility for his house but to burn down. And yet he was defending his status quo, defending his worldview. And so this is where, when we talk about certain aspects of climate denial and people who are having a really hard time reconciling themselves to this new reality we find ourselves in, I don't think it's all cynicism. It's not all partisan. It's not all, people who just aren't getting it. It's really a lot of people who really want to hold on to the wonderful life they have.
Again, his book is called Fire Weather. The author is John Vaillant. It is spelled Vaillant. And I want to end on this clip of him talking to Simon Fraser University last January because I think it's very important.
Oil, which still drives about 80% of the world's economic activity, is a 19th century fuel. The internal combustion engine was prototyped in 1860. Standard Oil, Exxon Esso, was founded in 1870. Bitumen The stuff they mine and melt in Fort McMurray is not a fuel at all. It is a driveway sealer. It takes billions of cubic feet of natural gas every day to melt and fractionate bitumen into substances Southern petroleum markets will want to buy. Again, we just crossed the 4 million barrel a day mark up in Fort Mac. So why on earth are we still doing this? Especially when scientists have understood the basics of the greenhouse effect literally since the 18th century. If you're in the petroleum industry, you're in the fire industry, which means you're in the CO2 industry, which means you're in the climate changing industry. What's alarming and possibly indictable is the fact that petroleum companies have known and discussed this for more than half a century. In fact, they've been leaders in climate science. And because Exxon in 1982 was the biggest corporation in the world, the wealthiest corporation in the world, it could hire the best scientists. And it did. And it put them on the climate file. And it said, figure out where this is all going. We understand that CO2 retains heat. We understand that it's a product of our industry. So what are the impacts going to be? This foreknowledge presented a quandary. How do you separate oil from fire or burning from emissions? You can't. And so starting in the 1980s, the industry, along with its allies in business and government, in churches, in finance, and in the media, embarked on a disinformation campaign to disavow and undermine their own science. It took me 7 years to figure it out. But this is a fact. The petroleum industry, the energy industry, is a servant of fire.